to your brain, it is not a virtual reality. It is your actual reality.
Medieval crimes are being committed.
I come with clean hands.
Victims of horrific crimes want justice.
We don't have anything better than this.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
Just a few years ago, we were talking about how social media evidence can be useful in court and is increasingly being used in court.
Yeah, I can remember we did a great podcast with Yvonne McDermott-Rees and with Carolina all about social media and how it gets used. But I know today we're going to concentrate on a new type of evidence, a different type that's also beginning to slowly enter international courtrooms. We're talking about digital reconstruction models. And I've been noticing more and more organizations using them as ways of kind of mocking up spaces and show the real physicality of things like prisons.
Yeah, and at last year's annual ICC's Assembly of State Parties, there was a side event which included virtual reality models. The installation was hosted by the Office of the Prosecutor, and it was labeled VR as a tool for advancing accountability for international crimes. Now, Janet, have you ever tried VR or this installation?
I have to say, I haven't actually. I do know that I've worked alongside people who are using VR for advocacy purposes and showing people what's actually going on the ground. I'm absolutely less sure what it would mean inside the courtroom, how that would work.
I've seen some VR, but I've only seen it more in the gamification. My brother used to make VR landscapes, so I've visited some of those. But on the advocacy side, there was this immense exhibition at the ASP, an installation called Nobody's Listening, to raise awareness for the Yazidi genocide by Islamic State.
Well, I'm hoping at some point I get to actually experience more of these things myself. But in the meantime, just to kind of untangle the field and to ask some of the really basic questions, which I can imagine other people like me need to ask, we've brought together three amazing female experts. So to start with, we have Sarah Zarmsky. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Sarah wrote in the Journal of International Criminal Justice about why seeing should not always be believing, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. I know she's doing a PhD in Essex, and she's also a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, the Human Rights Center there. And friends of the podcast, I know she's also deputy managing editor of the international legal blog Opiniono Juris. And we have Brittan Heller. Hi, Brittan.
Hi there.
Brittan is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and an affiliate at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. She works at the intersection of technology and human rights at the law, and she is an incoming affiliate at the Yale Law School Information Society Project and the Stanford Law School Program on Democracy and the Internet.
Yes, I have an alphabet soup of letters after my name, but I think most relevant for this podcast, I'm a lecturer in international law at Stanford, and I previously worked at the ICC, at the ICTR, and for the United States government prosecuting genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and transnational violent crime.
I just wanted to clarify the alphabet soup because I also mentioned the ICC, which I didn't clarify, which is the International Criminal Court, and Brittan talked about that ICTR, which is the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda.
Oh. Yeah, it is a lot. And we've already got two experts, but we've also included a third expert in this collection. And we have Shirin Anlen. Shirin, hi.
Hey, Janet. Hey, Stephanie.
And Shirin is a creative technologist. She's a researcher and artist based in New York, and she's exploring the societal implications of emerging technology with this focus on artificial intelligence. And she's currently a media technologist, which I'm sure we'll find out about what exactly that means, with the human rights organization Witness, their Technologies, Threats and Opportunities program. So with all three, we wanted to start from the basics. We've already introduced the idea that we may be talking about digital reconstruction and about virtual reality. Can we run through with the three of you what that is and maybe also what it isn't? Do you want to kick us off, Sarah?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me also. I've been a big fan of the podcast for a while, so I'm really excited to be here. But here, I'm not so much the expert in virtual reality, so I would probably defer to the other two who probably have more expertise. But from what I understand it to be, it's a simulative experience that would allow users to have an immersive feel of the environment that's depicted. In a criminal law context where I've been researching, and international criminal law context as well, I would add it could be used to bring courtroom actors to certain places like crime scenes or conflict zones. Whereas digital reconstructions can include digital evidence platforms or digital information platforms that allow individuals to explore scenes on a device. It might not be VR, but it could include elements of VR. Such as through panoramic photography, like where you could click through a crime scene on a device and not necessarily be in a headset. And, in the context of international criminal law, digital reconstructions, I think, have been used more frequently or have actually entered the ICC courtroom, where I think virtual reality is a much newer platform that we should see hopefully in the future.
The ways that I've seen, and I don't actually say virtual reality, I say XR, which is a term that means extended reality. And that encompasses a whole body of technology, from virtual reality, which is an immersive headset that you wear, from augmented reality, which lets you put digital overlays on the physical world that you're experiencing, and mixed reality, which is the ability to go between the digital and the physical worlds and actually toggle between the two. It's a distinction with a difference. One of them requires a lot more hardware, and the way that your body and your mind react to these technologies is different. And there's also a different set of risk factors when you're looking at VR versus AR. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to talk about XR today. The judicial world is just starting to realize that XR exists outside of the advocacy space. This podcast is actually very well timed because 2 days ago, the first trial, to my knowledge, took place in the metaverse. And this was in a court in Colombia. And all of the litigants and the judge, they all agreed that they were going to meet in a virtual courtroom. And it was a dispute resolution over $170,000 worth of parking tickets.
Goodness, that's extraordinary, Brittan. I mean, you just say they met in the metaverse. I mean, what the hell?
I know I say it kind of blasé, but I woke up before the sun got up my time to log into YouTube to watch this, because it just the judge also used generative AI, ChatGPT, to research and explain the reasoning for part of her decisions. And this is the second case that I've seen do this out of Colombia. To my knowledge, this was really kind of exciting, surreal, and scary, depending on where you fall on the interpretive spectrum, because it's the first time I have seen extended reality be applied in the apparatus of state power.
I just feel we have so much we're going to explore further. So if I just interrupt you for a moment and just bring in Shirin and ask Shirin, okay, what's your response to enabling somebody like me to understand what we're talking about and what we're not talking about?
Yeah, I think the definition of XR is really good. I will stick to VR for a second, because I think what it's not the AR, and it's not the full immersive object that communicate with each other. And then in VR, there's usually the confusion between 360 video, that you sit and look around and can move your head and see behind you or up or down. But you cannot get close to anything. It's like a video that just play in front of your eyes. And then there is the full immersion VR, which you can walk and you can touch with controller, move things around. So you can really engage and interact with the environment. So I will just add those two definitions.
May I add one other point that I think is very important to understanding immersive technologies? When people ask me to give talks about virtual reality and XR and augmented reality, the first thing that I always say is, this is not social media. And a lot of people look at this and talk about it like it is the next evolution of Facebook or Twitter. Social XR is just one way that this can be applied. But the main difference to me is the way that these experiences are interpreted by your brain. What I mean when I say the way these experiences are interpreted by your brain is when you have an experience in XR, it is processed through your hippocampus in the same way that you create memories. So when people have come to me and said that they were assaulted in XR, they actually have the psychological and behavioral affordances of the sexual assault victims that I used to encounter as a prosecutor, both on the international and the domestic level. To your brain, it is not a virtual reality. It is your actual reality. So when somebody comes up to you and is violent or aggressive or behaves in an inappropriate manner, it feels like having somebody in your living room grabbing your crotch or pushing you to the floor. This means that what on social media is an issue of speech is actually an issue of behavior in a spatial computing environment. When you look at content moderation as well, on social media, you look at conduct and content, and that's how you determine it. And so it's often framed in the under the rubric of hate speech, free speech, acceptable speech, unacceptable speech. Content moderation and program architecture in XR is conduct, content, and environment, because you have to create the architecture and really the scaffolding of the environment that you go into, and your brain and your body feel like it's real. That's why it is not social media.
We're going to get back to also how your brain processes it with Sarah, who talks about this effect of what happens to your brain when you watch VR and what's something that judges have to watch out for. To take it back to the kind of courtroom experience, because Brittan, what you're talking about is the way that is being used. And I can say indeed that it is very immersive and it's extremely overwhelming to be in a VR environment. For me, it was even more overwhelming because my brother actually passed away and I only got to see these VR worlds after he died. And knowing that he created this landscape was very soothing and beautiful and also very odd, kind of. But for example, I know that his friends had a funeral for him in VR, which I totally understood because it is a very visual space that you can have this in and you feel that you're there. So there's a lot of emotions that come with being in this completely different environment. Now, and a courtroom is usually something quite devoid of emotion. They strip that kind of emotionality from a lot of things. So when we look at the way these things are reconstructed, how does that also, that has an effect on judges, but it also has an effect on witnesses. Do you think, Sarah, that the courts are ready for that kind of technology? I mean, sometimes they barely understand how cell phones work. So I wonder, how are they going to deal with this whole new situation?
Yeah, I mean, as with a bunch of other digital evidence, like I'm sure like open source evidence, stuff like that it's really a hot topic right now. There's not really clear guidelines on how to deal with this stuff yet, especially at like a court like the ICC. And yeah, when you bring up, there's some difficulties both practically and ethically, I think, that, we would need to consider. And also with regards to the right to a fair trial, which I can get into a bit later. But I think practically, these tools are really great because they can bring people to places that are otherwise, you might not be able to go to if the place doesn't exist anymore, if it's been destroyed, or if it's not safe, especially in the context of like international criminal law, where we're dealing with a lot of active conflict zones and stuff like that. And it can really be useful to have this visual component. And I think it could, if done properly, be a strong tool for accountability purposes at the ICC. But you do have concerns, a lot of these, we have to remember that these aren't actual environments. It's not the exact same, although the effects could be similar as, experiencing something. It's still not the exact same thing as going to an actual crime scene or a conflict zone. And so sometimes that we have this seeing is believing effect, which I take from the title of my paper. But this is actually an actual scientific phenomenon that people, they've done studies on judges and jurors and stuff like that. And a lot of times people will place undue reliance on evidence that looks very scientific or technologically advanced. And it can be difficult to remember that even though these reconstructions can be really well made, and I'm not saying that they aren't normally, but they still are prone to human error. They can have bias coded into them. And especially a lot of times VR and digital reconstructions that have been used at courts are made in part from witness testimony, so talking to people that have actually been at the crime scene or experienced it. And of course, the human memory is malleable. You have to be aware of asking leading questions if you're going to be, designing something so that it's done in a way that doesn't have so much bias. And yes, there's also ethical concerns because, as you could probably imagine, if you have to talk about something over and over again to create a digital reconstruction as a witness, it can be really traumatic. But on the flip side, there's also this vicarious or secondary trauma that the makers of digital reconstructions or virtual reality could face when having to, listen to people recount their horrific stories. This is a phenomenon that's been studied a lot with open source researchers, content moderation specialists. So this could also be something to be aware of when we're making digital reconstructions and virtual reality.
I feel that we're raising so many issues already. I know that's the nature of this kind of broad surface podcast, but maybe, Shirin, I understand that you actually have made some of these VR models. How do you go about making something for people to experience?
Yeah, so I haven't made anything for court, so I haven't dealt with ethical issue of accuracy in that sense. But I made for reconstruction of cultural heritage and places that don't exist or places that got demolished. We can definitely walk through. It's very interesting to think of the element of how precise and accurate you want it to be. So you can start by digital reconstruction can be, I'm looking at a blueprint of a place and I'm just rebuilding it in 3D. And then on that, you can start kind of bake or apply texture from the real world, right? So you can take photos and apply the real colors, the real graffiti if they are in place, holes, and then it's kind of shaping and bring more the data from the environment to the 3D. And then you can move to different types of techniques from scanning. So you can have different types of scanning from expensive one to very cheap one, and you can assess the accuracy based on those prices too. Which also provide a lot of data points and a lot of data that you can afterward export into a report and provide as a dedication for the data that you just captured. So all that scanning that moves around in a space and capture all the light, the distance from the camera to the object, rebuild that object in 3D.
It sounds very detailed and very specific. I can only imagine it takes a long time.
It can be pretty fast. So and you can it's much faster to scan or use photogrammetry, for example, if you take multiple photos from different perspectives and reconstruct from photos, than to rebuild the object in 3D. So it's much faster to just do it that way. Again, then there are post-production processes that you need to clean up the noise. You need to kind of shape a little bit holes, and then you intervene, you put a human intervention in the data that you just captured. So you kind of it's a loose case of how accurate it is and what were your intervention for that. But we also have new apps. So it's keep evolving, right? Because we are just evolving all the time. So there are apps and that you can just scan with your phone. So now it's very fast and very accessible if you have new iPhone or new Android. And then you can just upload it to your computer and fix what needs to be fixed and use it.
So now we heard a bit about how you make it. And Brittan, we've already heard you a bit about the things you have to watch out for. And we're going to talk more about the cons of it. But I want to ask you first, what are the pros? Why do you think prosecutors want to use it in court? What makes it so compelling?
One of the founders of the VR industry, Dr. Tom Furness from University of Washington, describes XR as the closest thing to splitting the atom, and that kind of paradigm shift. This is the most persuasive technology that we've ever developed. It is the best tool for learning because all of the different vectors that a person has to learn are encompassed within this experience. And for most people, you learn the best through doing. So this adds a really tangible, experiential aspect to any content that you're engaging with. I put my 101-year-old grandmother in the headset, and we basically put her in the bottom of the sea, and she got to interact with whales and fish and turtles and swarms of jellyfish. And she said it was one of the most amazing things she'd ever experienced in her life. It's for me a transformational paradigm because I think because of the world building aspect of it. And it to me, something that can impact people's emotion and cognition and physicality so profoundly deserves both our respect and appropriate caution. But for me, it's something that generates wonder and awe.
Now, Sarah, this is a wonderful immersive tool that is highly persuasive. What are the problems with that in a courtroom? What if the ICC prosecutor could make a wonderfully immersive VR experience for everybody to know just what it is like to be on the run for the Janjaweed in Darfur? What issues do you see with that?
I think, it's important to note that these are really great tools, and I don't doubt that they can be great tools. But because they are so compelling, and they really do have these profound effects, like Brittan has mentioned, that's what kind of makes it so, I think, scary from a fair trial perspective. And also, we have to recognize that this isn't really for advocacy purposes or stuff like that, but in a court of law, this is to put someone in jail, right? So I do think that the fair trial concerns are really important. So, like I said, I don't think to public knowledge, virtual reality has entered the ICC courtroom yet, but there have been really impressive digital reconstructions, such as by Situ Research in the Mali situations for the Al-Mahdi and Al-Hassan cases. And that platform was developed especially for the Office of the Prosecutor. So that's an organization, making a platform for the OTP, giving its expertise there. And then I'm not saying it's not a great tool for the case and really helpful, but at the same time, the defense is not afforded nearly the same expertise. And, a lot of times the defense doesn't get the best cooperation with, technology companies or social media companies. And it can be difficult to acquire the expertise or the training necessary or the budget to hire the experts to counter such compelling technological evidence. So I think this goes to the bigger issue of equality of arms between the defense and the prosecution at the ICC. We know that the defense only has a very small fraction of the amount that the OTP has of the ICC budget. And so they just don't have the same amount of time, resources, and manpower to be really querying this evidence in a way that would be consistent with the right to a fair trial that's enshrined in the Rome Statute and is a universal human right. So yes, I think they can be really compelling, but we really need to make sure that we have these kind of safeguards. We're educating judges and other courtroom actors about potential biases that can be encoded into these tools. And yes, just any efforts to, improve equality of arms, training, affording training to the defense that, the OTP might receive could be really beneficial in that respect.
I'm trying to imagine some of the judges at the ICC sort of sitting with goggles on. I think that they tend to be somewhat on the, it doesn't mean to say that if you're old, you can't do VR, but they do tend to be somewhat on the older side, and they aren't necessarily all completely au fait with social media, etc.
Yeah, I would also add that at the ICC in particular, admissibility with evidence is kind of strange in a sense that they kind of admit everything and then decide on the weight of the evidence in their final deliberations. And a lot of those deliberations aren't public, so we don't actually really know what they're going to be focusing on and how much weight they're going to place on that particular item of evidence. So it can also, this is a concern that's been raised. I used to intern at the IBA Hague office, for example. It's a big fair trial concern because the defense can't really strategize with how to allocate its resources if it doesn't know necessarily how much weight the judges are going to place on something like a digital reconstruction.
And Shirin, I was wondering whether you also have a perspective on these risks, the general risks of human bias and error bias, because you were talking about inserting the human in at some point in the model making.
Yeah, I think we always have the human bias, right? In every technology and any tool we are using, that's a risk. I think even when you bring a photography, an image to court, you have the risk of a human bias taking that. So there's like the ultimate risk of bringing the bias, but also like you have also the potential of bringing different perspective in VR. And of course, it depends how you do it and what the fairness of that process. But since you can walk around, I don't know, reconstruction of like a place, you don't have one angle of that piece of evidence. You have multiple angles, and you can combine multiple images that have been taken from multiple humans. And so you can also advocate that it's bringing more freedom in that sense to reconstruct something in a way that is more fair.
And Brittan, you talked about being the techie person in the office of the prosecutor in the DOJ, and that there's one person that then gets to do all the kind of tech stuff. Do you think that judges will be open to kind of being trained on how to view this digital evidence and to kind of make this technological leap? What is your experience with trying to explain this stuff to not so much your fellow prosecutors who might are quite willing to use it, but to judges who actually have to assess it?
I'm going to say very respectfully, it is like pulling teeth. With all the respect I can muster, it's always a challenge to educate courts about new technology, because I think, as Sarah and Shirin said, people give undue weight to new ways to depict information without necessarily being able to separate that from the valuative weight of the information itself. Some of the other concerns that come up for me when I think about using XR in courtroom are right now that people use avatars, right? The avatars are a digitally animated representation of you. It is not necessarily the same thing to me as having a Zoom or a video chat based evidence, like I know is done for many vulnerable witnesses and victims, because the resolution doesn't pick up your eyes. There's a theory called the uncanny valley. And if you've seen one of the new Star Wars films, even though they made a physical recreation of Carrie Fisher posthumously, it still looks really odd. And the reason it looks really odd is because there are so many muscles and micro expressions around your eyes. And you get so much from being able to meet the gaze of another person. You make all of these judgments about their reliability and their veracity and their character through eye contact. And we lose that when we enter the metaverse, at least at this point. There are different types of programs that I've seen that are more like holograms than like avatars, but the first court case used avatars. So everyone looked like they were from Pixar, and it was a little bit like theater of the absurd to me. Then you flip that, and it might have been theater of the absurd, but it wasn't funny. The reason it wasn't funny is because at least in the jurisdiction of Colombia, there is really a large problem with access to justice. And so judges there are looking at some of the benefits of this. If people can't physically be in the same space, maybe this is the next best thing.
I'm also wondering about issues of diversity within this. I mean, we have brought together 3 highly qualified women, but I'm wondering how many women there are in this area, or whether it's mainly more dominated by men, whether it's very much people in the Western or the Northern world who are involved in doing all the work. I mean, we're aware, aren't we, of how much bias there is in the design of stuff.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed is that these VR headsets are giant, and they fit very well on my husband's head and even on my 13-year-old kind of largest male child's head, but my head is a little too small for them and I have to put them really tight and things like that. So it's also just designed not with average ladies in mind.
So Stephanie, did you feel nauseous in the headset?
Absolutely. We did the first thing is kind of an introduction, which is awesome. And then I had a program because I was being all educational. So I got one of those like solar system, trip through the solar system, and it was like need immediate, those anti-seasick pills were very much needed.
Do you know why you got seasick?
No.
It's called simulation sickness. And when these devices were first designed, you picked it out kind of experientially. The average interpupillary distance for the average user was made for a 5'10" Caucasian male. That was their average user. And everyone on this call has probably has a shorter average interpupillary distance. If you've ever gone to the optometrist, the distance between your pupils is one of the measurements they take to fit you for glasses. It's like the hardware was designed to put 51% of the global population in the wrong prescription glasses.
And that, I assume, also applies to everything to do with VR, is that those issues are also behind the scenes.
Correct. I've published on this how the hardware itself was not designed to accommodate African hairstyles and textures, or to accommodate people with different types of disabilities, or ethnic and religious minorities who wear hijabs, turbans, or yarmulkes. It's actually a really big problem, because if the metaverse is supposed to be where we live, work, play, and maybe go to court, you need it to be accessible for all people.
Shirin, you're a developer, so you must also have that in mind.
Yeah, I wanted to add the hardware is absolutely one thing, that it was developed and built by men, but also the computer vision, the computer graphic, like mathematics is also ones that was developed by majority of men. And they also, the way like female and male understand 3D and understand the illusion of 3D is also different. So male have this like parallel effect that through that they build on or create the illusion of 3D, and females have more like based on shadow and contours of the environment. So it's also the way the technology, the algorithm we are using in order to develop those environments are also different for genders. And also the way we are developing the landscape and the immersive environment is also different. The way females experience environment, we are less safe in public spaces, we are having different types of reactions versus male. It's all about who feel comfortable and safe and who feel like they want to take the hats off and feel safe again in their own private environment.
That's really astute. So it's like, who would feel comfortable being blindfolded in a public space? Those are the people who primarily use VR.
Absolutely. It's a very weird sensation to have that. And I think, maybe as a woman, it taps into some basic fear or something that's been ingrained at you that you don't do that, because you make yourself vulnerable because you can't see your environment and you're somewhere else. It's not something I think a woman would necessarily come up with as a good idea to do that in public.
I can't comment so much on the hardware stuff, but I can comment on diversity and inclusivity more in regards to the international justice aspect. When you're using these types of digital reconstructions or maybe eventually virtual reality at a court like the ICC, I think there's definitely room to both positively and negatively affect aspects of diversity and inclusivity. So on the negative side, I think digital reconstructions could contribute to this idea of distant justice, where we end up relying too heavily on a reconstruction to understand what happened and maybe not necessarily listening to or silencing those who are most impacted by the situation. And this is a common concern that's been raised in the context of open source investigations. And sometimes digital reconstructions, like the one that has been used for the Mali cases, incorporated aspects of open source evidence. So they use like open source photos, videos, satellite imagery. And so, this kind of goes hand in hand with this aspect of distant justice. And you don't want to maybe not listen to those who are actually being affected by the situations we're investigating. If these are all made by people, in The Hague or something like that. But on the positive side, if these are done with inclusivity in mind, I think if we're hiring people from the situation areas and really working with them to make the digital reconstructions, this could be really positive. Because there's also, the common criticism of the ICC is that it's like this glass box in this Western country, like in The Hague. And a lot of times they're prosecuting cases like in the Global South, for instance. And this could help to bridge that gap and kind of bring more people from situation areas to be involved in the process that maybe otherwise wouldn't have their voices heard if they're, included in these reconstructions. And it kind of comes to mind this really cool reconstruction that Amnesty International did of a Syrian torture prison. It hasn't been used in an international court, to my knowledge, but it really stands out in the sense that it has this audio-visual component. So when you're going through this prison cells, they have like recordings that you can click on from actual survivors that escaped the prison. And so these people are like being included, and otherwise we might not have been able to hear their voices, or it's a lot different than, reading or like hearing about something, but actually kind of having that visual and audio component, I think, is really compelling. So I think it could both, silence or enhance voices depending on the relevant safeguards that are paid attention to.
Just to say, we'll put a link to the Sednaya space that Amnesty has created, because I agree it's important. Steph?
You touched a bit upon it already, the kind of things this is used for, but now I think a kind of wrap-up question for all of you is where's the focus on now in the digital reconstruction platform in courts, and where do you see it going in the future? What do you think? Which way do you think it will go?
I'm hopeful that trying to help judicial advocates and adjudicators have a better understanding of both the situation and the evidence. That, I think, is the best thing that happens. I think there are secondary concerns, like the ones I've talked about, where if we actually move proceedings into the metaverse, and at least when I was at the ICC, we had challenges getting on the ground and having access to victims, witnesses, crime scenes, et cetera. So to me, that would be a potential positive development. However, there are foundational legal issues that I would want to see sussed out before I was comfortable with that. And those relate to jurisdiction, to venue, and to victim witness protection. So until we can get to those really foundational issues, I would be cautiously optimistic about the use in this for judicial procedures, but maybe not jurisdiction and venue.
And Shirin, what are the developments that you see that could be particularly useful for the courtroom space? Or maybe just in your field, what you think the big innovation will be?
I think for advocacy, there is a lot of potential. I'm not sure about court. Again, it's a different types of ethical consideration that we need to take. But to tell the story, to bring it forward, to visualize what happened, to reconstruct a scene, to investigate, to have those light reflection or mirror reflection that shows what I could see if I was in the scene and I can understand it from just a flat image. There is a lot of great work that is being done including real life sounds to reconstruction of bombing areas and so on. I do think that it's also good to keep in mind like the metaverse question that Brittan is bringing, but also like the digital twin that is starting to be also a part of our world. Like everything is like aiming to be also a digital twin of that physical element. And as we are also developing and creating architect and blueprints online, right? So everything might not be just a reconstruction, but just it's already exists in the virtual, and how we are bringing it forward to the physical and telling those stories through that, or involving those virtual elements that already exist.
Sarah, do you see the ICC judges conducting a trial in the metaverse?
I don't. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I do see us using VR as evidence soon, perhaps, especially as it's used more and more for advocacy purposes. I think also as the Ukraine situation progresses, maybe at the ICC, we could see that. Because we do have this flood of open source evidence coming in from Ukraine. I think there's going to be ways of maybe presenting that in a visual way, such as through a deconstruction that could come up. And I saw just today, actually, it was announced that Human Rights Watch In Situ are going to launch a cool digital reconstruction of a Russian strike in Ukraine next week. So I think this is going to be an up and coming thing. And if not digital reconstructions, I do think virtual reality itself could make its way into the courtroom. Like you mentioned at the ASP meeting in December, the OTP itself put on a exhibition about using virtual reality in the courtroom. So I think it's definitely in the front of people's minds. And, I think although we really need to approach it with caution, and I know I'm very critical of it in my article, I do think if done correctly, there's hope for, really using it for accountability purposes in a meaningful way. And I also think there could be the development of new guidelines. So like as we had with open source evidence, when that really started coming to fruition, we developed the Berkeley Protocol, and that's really helped to assess open source evidence in trials and social media evidence. And so I could see this coming into play, that we could make these protocols to kind of catch the law up with where it's moving.
Thanks all three so much for joining. At the end of the podcast, we always ask a number of different questions, and a couple of standard questions we have are, is there a particular court case that you are particularly intrigued by, or you like chatting about, or you like teaching about, that you'd like to tell us about, so that we can also maybe explore that in another podcast sometime? Brittan?
I'm fascinated with a preliminary holding in Panara v. HTC Corporation, coming out of the Western District of New York at the end of 2022. This is the first holding to talk about accessibility in the metaverse, to my knowledge. There was a blind user who wanted to use Viveport Infinity, which described itself as the Netflix of VR, but was claiming that there were no closed captions. So he was unable to address his visual impairment. The company said, we're just a platform. We don't have any responsibility to put closed captions for disabled users. And the court said, actually, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you're a place of public accommodation, and you have to do this. Now, they noted that this shouldn't have precedential weight going forward, but they used the fact that Americans with Disabilities Act is saying a virtual space is a place of public accommodation is fascinating to me, and it really implicates the blurring between digital and tangible spaces in a way that I see just starting.
Yay, judges.
Shirin, is there any court case that you, or any case that reconstruction you did, or a case that is going through the courts that you find particularly interesting, or are we just extremely boring law nerds and you don't have a favorite court case and we're weird for having one?
I do have a favorite reconstruction case, if that can help. It's a Recover for Muscle. It's from 2016. And what I like about it, it's ISIS destroyed a few cultural heritage in Iraq, and it was reconstructed using a crowdsourced image. And so it was pretty innovative at the time to use like different types of images taken from different times, from different people, and reconstruct the entire place.
One of our big things is that we always ask everybody that we have on what they're reading, watching, listening to. It can be legally related. It can be something that you do to not think about the stuff that you have to do for work. So we're interested in everything. If you go out gardening or you're raising the world's biggest sunflower plantation, we also want to know about it. What do you do to either immerse yourself in the field or to get away from all of it all?
I'm going to be honest, as a PhD student, I kind of really just don't want to do any additional reading at the end of the day besides what I actually have to do for my thesis, which, anything related to online harm and international criminal law is what I'm reading. There's a lot of great work, I'm sure you've known, Digital Witness by some of the people at Berkeley and Essex. But yeah, in terms of non-law things, I'm currently watching The Last of Us on HBO. It's a great show. I love Pedro Pascal. And then to unwind, I do a lot of cycling classes. But yeah.
Shirin?
I'm also watching The Last of Us, which I'm so obsessed. And all the fungi world is like something I started to kind of like dig even more, because it's like about fungus. I'll say that like kind of similar. Like as a researcher, I don't want to read more after my work, but I'm really digging deep into all the world of generative AI and the implication of that, which is changing every day. And there's a lot of like follow up to do every day. And other than that, I have 2 dogs, so I'm doing a lot of dog training and I love it.
Brittan, do you have time for anything besides your job and your family?
Absolutely not. My daughter is 6 months old now, and every moment with her is a joy. However, she seems to really, really like sitting with me when I talk about technology, human rights, and the law. So she's definitely my kid.
That sounds like a really good fit.
So thank you all 3 so much for joining in. If you just hold on a moment, we wanted to also do a shout out at the end of the podcast because we've just recently decided to get ourselves onto Patreon, and we've just this week got our first sponsors. And part of our promise was to say thank you. It doesn't really matter, if people just give us a couple of euros, that's absolutely great. We're really, really grateful to have a little bit because it helps to pay for coffee. So thank you for being part of our community.
That is a big thanks to Philip Grant.
And Reed Brody.
And Ranit Mishori, who's actually suggested some books for us to read and comment on, and some of the books I didn't know about. So I'm really thankful for that.
And Dinaka Pardice. Thank you all so much for buying us some coffees this month and in months in the future. So thank you all 3 so much for joining in. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode has been recorded at home, but we'd like to give a shout out to our regular host, Humanity Hub in The Hague. Music is by audionautics.com, and you can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.